For an avoidant, needing another person is not simply uncomfortable. It is a threat to the entire story they have built about who they are. Their whole identity, the version of themselves they present to the world, and more importantly, the version they tell themselves in private, rests on a single foundational belief, which is that they do not need anyone, that they are self-sufficient, that they can take connection or leave it, that they are the one who is never quite as invested as the other person. This belief is not a small preference. It is the load-bearing wall of their sense of safety, the thing that lets them feel in control of a world that closeness would otherwise make dangerous. And this is the key to understanding the strange and painful sequence in which they hurt you on purpose and then, later, need you desperately, because the deliberate hurt and the desperate need are both, in different ways, about that wall and about what happens when it finally cracks. Consider first why they hurt you deliberately, because it is more revealing than it appears. When an avoidant is close to someone and the closeness deepens to the point where they begin to feel their own need rising, that rising need is experienced not as warmth but as danger, because it threatens the foundational belief that they do not need anyone. A person who is starting to need you is a person whose entire self-story is under threat, and to protect the story, they will often act in a way designed to prove, mostly to themselves, that they do not need you after all. And nothing proves you do not need someone quite so convincingly as being willing to hurt them. The deliberate wound is, in part, a demonstration staged for their own benefit, a way of saying to themselves, look, I can hurt this person, I can push them away, I can treat them as expendable, therefore I do not need them, therefore my story is intact, therefore I am safe. The cruelty was aimed at you, but its deepest purpose was to reassure them that they were still the one who needed less. This is why the deliberate hurt so often intensified precisely as the relationship deepened, and why the cruelest moments tended to follow the closest ones. The closer you got, the more the avoidance need rose, and the more their need rose, the more their foundational belief was threatened, and the more they had to prove, through some act of coldness or wounding, that the need was not real, that they were still self-contained, still in control, still the one who could walk away. You were not being punished for doing something wrong. You were being used as the proof in an argument the avoidant was having with themselves, an argument about whether they needed you, and every wound was another attempt to win that argument on the side of not needing you. The tragedy is that the very need they were trying to disprove was real and growing, and the harder they worked to deny it through cruelty, the more it revealed how much there was to deny. I want to pause and be clear, because understanding this must never become an excuse. Knowing that the deliberate hurt was an attempt to protect their self-story does not make the hurt acceptable, does not obligate you to forgive it, and does not mean you should return to it. A person who wounds you to preserve their own illusion of self-sufficiency is still choosing to wound you, and the psychological reason behind the choice explains it without redeeming it. You are allowed to understand exactly why they did it and still decide, completely and permanently, that you will not be the sacrifice on the altar of someone else's need to feel invulnerable. Comprehension is not absolution. The fact that their cruelty was in service of a fragile self-image does not make you responsible for protecting that image by absorbing more cruelty. You can see the whole mechanism clearly and still walk away from it without a shred of guilt. Now, here is what happens when they need you, and why it lands on them with such devastating force. When you leave, and the absence sets in, and the need they spent so much energy denying finally rises past the point where any amount of self-story can contain it, something more than a feeling collapses. Their identity collapses, because the need they are now flooded with is not just the ordinary pain of missing someone, it is the living disproof of the foundational belief their entire sense of safety was built on. They needed you all along, and now they cannot pretend otherwise, and the collapse of the pretense is the collapse of the wall that held up their whole way of being in the world. This is why an avoidance need, when it finally breaks through, can be so shattering to them, so much more destabilizing than an ordinary person's grief. They are not only losing you, they are losing the story that they do not need anyone, the story that let them feel safe, and its loss leaves them exposed in a way they have spent their entire life avoiding. So, when they reach for you now, in the grip of that need, understand what you are witnessing. You are witnessing the confession they could never make while you were there, the admission of the very thing the deliberate hurt was designed to deny. Their reaching says, in effect, I needed you. I always needed you. I hurt you precisely because I could not bear how much I needed you. And now that you are gone, I can no longer pretend. It is, in a strange way, the most honest they have ever been, because the need has finally overwhelmed the defenses that kept the honesty buried. And this is exactly why it is so hard to resist, because it can feel like the truth finally arriving, the real them finally emerging, the mask finally falling to reveal the love that was underneath all along. And there is truth in that, but there is also a trap. And the trap is the assumption that because the confession is real, the return would be safe. Here is why it is not safe, and you must hold this against the full force of their reaching. The confession is happening now, in your absence, because your absence is the one condition under which the wall of their self-story has collapsed. But walls like that rebuild. The belief that they do not need anyone was not a passing mood, it was the structure of a lifetime, and structures of a lifetime do not stay demolished simply because a loss knocked them down for a while. The moment you return, the moment the need is fed and the loss is no longer threatened, the avoidance system begins to do what it has always done, which is to restore the wall, to rebuild the story of self-sufficiency, to push the need back below the surface where it feels safe. And as the wall goes back up, so does everything that came with it, the distance, the coldness, and yes, the willingness to hurt you in order to prove once again that they do not need you. The confession you are hearing now is genuine. But it is a confession made in the rubble of a wall that will rebuild itself the instant you make the mistake of standing close enough to be walled out again. This is the thing the intensity of their need is perfectly designed to hide, that the need and the cruelty are not opposites but partners, two halves of the same machinery. The need is what rises when the wall falls. The cruelty is what defends the wall when the need threatens to breach it while you are near. In your absence, you are seeing only the need, because there is no closeness to defend against, no wall to protect, and so no cruelty required. But bring yourself close again, and you supply the very thing the cruelty exists to manage, and the cruelty returns, not because they stopped needing you, but precisely because they need you, and their need, felt in your presence, is the intolerable thing their whole system is built to attack. You would be returning to a person for whom your closeness reactivates the exact conflict that produced the deliberate hurt the first time. The need does not resolve that conflict. It is one side of it, and the return simply reintroduces the other. So, you must not mistake the collapse of their self-story for a transformation of their capacity, because they are entirely different things. The collapse is what your absence did to them. It is temporary, and it reverses. Transformation is what they would have to do to themselves, slowly, deliberately, from the inside, and it does not happen automatically just because a loss knocked the wall down. A person can have their self-sufficiency story shattered by your absence and still possess no new ability whatsoever to tolerate closeness, which means that when the wall rebuilds, as it will, they will be exactly the person they always were, with the need buried again and the cruelty available again. Genuine change would look like them choosing not to rebuild the wall, even as the closeness returns, staying open and needful and present precisely in the moments that used to trigger the defense. That is possible, but it is rare and slow and cannot be proven by the intensity of a need felt from across a distance. It can only be proven by how they behave once close again, and you are under no obligation to return in order to find out. None of this means the need is not real. It is often the realest thing they have ever felt, and I do not want you to armor yourself with the false belief that they never cared, because that belief will not survive the force of their reaching, and it is not true. They needed you. The confession is honest. What is not reliable is the conclusion that a need this real must mean the return would be different, because the need lives in the same person whose wall will rebuild, whose defenses will reactivate, whose cruelty will become available again the moment your closeness threatens the story they cannot live without. Their need is the truth of what you were to them. It is not a promise about what returning would be. It is worth naming the doubt that the deliberate hurt planted in you, because their need now is going to press directly on it. When a person hurts you on purpose while claiming, in 1,000 other moments, to care, they leave you unable to trust your own read of the situation. You could feel the intent behind the wound, and yet the ordinary logic said no one who cared would do that, so you began to doubt what you plainly perceived, to wonder whether you were imagining the cruelty, whether you were too sensitive, whether you had somehow caused it. That doubt was not a flaw in your perception. It was the predictable effect of being wounded by someone whose behavior did not match their claimed feeling, and it left you with a shaken relationship to your own judgment. And their desperate need, arriving now, will exploit that very doubt, because it will seem to say, "See, they did care all along. You were wrong to think the cruelty meant anything." Do not let the need rewrite your memory. The cruelty was real, and it was often deliberate, and the fact that they needed you underneath it does not erase that they chose to hurt you on top of it. Both were true then, and both are true now, and your original perception of the intent was very likely accurate. Let something land here for the part of you that absorbed the deliberate wounds and blamed yourself for them. There was nothing wrong with you. You were not too much, not too needy, not too sensitive. You were close to a person whose need for you had become a threat to their whole identity, and they attacked you to defend that identity. And the attack landed on you not because you deserved it, but because you were the one whose love had gotten close enough to endanger their story of not needing anyone. Your pain was real. The intent behind it was often real, and none of it was a verdict on your worth. It was a verdict on the fragility of a self-image that could not survive the admission that it needed you. You can finally lay down the long, exhausting search for what you did to deserve the cruelty, because the answer is that you did nothing except love someone whose need for that love had turned inside them into a danger they felt they had to attack. And understand what it means that their need is, in a sense, the confession the cruelty was designed to prevent. Every deliberate wound was a way of insisting they did not need you. The need they now feel is the collapse of that insistence, the truth breaking through the very denial the wounds were meant to enforce. So their reaching is not a contradiction of the cruelty, it is its resolution. The return of the buried truth that the cruelty spent all that energy burying. This is why it can feel so momentous when it comes, like the whole hidden reality of the relationship finally surfacing. But a confession, however momentous, is a statement about the past. It tells you what was true underneath all along. It does not tell you that the person has become able to live inside that truth rather than attacking it, and living inside it, not merely confessing it once it is safely distant, is the only thing that would make a return anything other than a wait for the wall and the wound to return. Let me speak to the moment their need reaches you, because it is one of the most disorienting things a person can experience, and no abstract understanding fully prepares you for it. When the one who hurt you deliberately comes reaching, undone, needing you in a way they never once allowed themselves to show, you will be pulled in every direction at once. The old love reawakens, the long-denied vindication arrives, the finally being needed after all the coldness. The tenderness rises in you at the sight of their collapse, and beneath it runs the seductive thought that a need this total must mean everything is different now. All of that will hit you together, and the first and wisest thing to do in that flood is nothing at all. Not to answer from inside the roar. The flood is not a reliable guide. It is every longing you carried, activated at once by the return of the person who carried them with you, and decisions made inside it will serve the longing rather than you. Let it recede first. The truth of the situation is still there on the other side of the flood, waiting to be seen clearly once the roar dies down, and you are allowed to say no, even to a need this desperate, even to a collapse this complete. This must be said with force, because being needed at the level of someone's very identity can feel almost impossible to refuse, especially for a person whose heart is generous. When someone's whole sense of self has shattered in your absence, and they are reaching for you to put it back together, it can feel as though their restoration is now your responsibility, as though you hold the only thing that can make them whole. You do not. You are not responsible for rebuilding a self-story that they built on the denial of needing anyone, and that their own behavior brought crashing down. Their collapse is not your emergency. Their need does not obligate your return. You are permitted to witness the full magnitude of their unraveling and still decide that you will not offer yourself as the material for their reconstruction, because you have watched what they do to the people who get close enough to matter, and you are no longer available to be that person. In fact, there is something you must see clearly here, which is that returning to become the thing that restores their sense of safety would be, in a sense, returning to rebuild the very wall that they hurt you to protect. Their self-sufficiency story required them to keep you at a distance and to wound you when you got too close. If you return now and let your presence soothe them back into stability, you help them rebuild that story. And the story, once rebuilt, has no more room for your closeness than it ever did. You would be volunteering to help reconstruct the exact structure that had you on the outside of it. The most clarifying thing you can do is to recognize that their need for you to make them whole is not a role you want, because the wholeness they are asking you to restore is a wholeness that was always built to exclude you. Let them rebuild themselves, if they can, on a foundation that does not require your sacrifice, because that is the only kind of rebuilding that could ever actually make room for you, and it is not a rebuilding you can do for them. And do not let the sheer intensity of their need convince you that it is the same as being cherished, because it is not, and the difference is everything. To be needed is to be required for someone else's relief. To be cherished is to be treasured for your own sake. The avoidant who deliberately hurt you and now needs you desperately has already shown you, in the clearest possible terms, that when their fear and your well-being collided, your well-being was the thing they were willing to sacrifice. Their need does not reverse that, it deepens it, because a person in the grip of overwhelming need is even more likely to consume you for their own relief than to hold you for your own sake. Being needed this badly can feel like the ultimate proof of your value, the vindication of every cold moment, but it is a counterfeit vindication because it values you for what you can do to soothe them rather than for who you are. You deserve to be cherished, not consumed, and a need that would use you as the cure for a wound they inflicted is not the love you were always reaching for. It is the same reaching to manage their own fear that hurt you the first time, wearing the disguise of devotion. There is a specific danger in responding to the need of someone who hurt you on purpose, and it deserves to be named without softening. When you return to a person who wounded you deliberately, and you return because their need moved you, you teach them, at a level beneath words, that the sequence works, that they can hurt you to protect their story, lose you, need you, reach for you, and have you back. You demonstrate that the wounding is survivable for them, that it costs them nothing they cannot later recover through enough desperation, and a pattern that is shown to have no lasting cost tends to repeat, often with less hesitation the next time, because the boundary that might have contained it has revealed itself to be negotiable. This is not a certainty, but it is a real risk, and it is a risk the intensity of their need is exquisitely designed to hide, because in the warmth of finally being needed, it is almost impossible to keep in view the plain fact that this same person, once their story was rebuilt and their fear returned, chose to hurt you on purpose. The need sits on top of that capacity. It does not replace it. Underneath the desperate reaching, the willingness to wound you when you again become a threat remains entirely intact. You must protect the part of yourself that was deliberately wounded, and part of protecting it is refusing to hand it back to the one who wounded it simply because they are now in pain. Consider what returning would actually ask of you. It would ask you to take the self that was cut, the trust that was betrayed, the tenderness that was punished, and offer all of it up again to the very person who cut and betrayed and punished it, in the hope that their need this time guarantees a gentler outcome. But need guarantees nothing except its own eventual relief, and once the need is relieved, the person holding your resubmitted trust is the same person who already showed you what they were willing to do with it. Your self-protection is not a wall built of resentment. It is the simple, dignified refusal to keep offering a wound to the thing that made it, and there is nothing cold in that refusal. There is only, at last, a proper care for a self that was not properly cared for by the one who hurt it. And you should understand how deeply the deliberate hurt worked on your sense of your own worth, because healing that is part of why you must be careful now. When someone you love wounds you on purpose, especially more than once, it installs a lie deep beneath your conscious mind. The lie that you are the kind of person who can be hurt on purpose, that your pain is acceptable collateral, that your tenderness invites punishment rather than protection. Undoing that lie is some of the most important work of your recovery, and here is why their need endangers it. Returning to the one who hurt you in answer to their need quietly confirms the lie all over again. Whispers to the wounded part of you that yes, this is your role, to be hurt and then to make yourself available to be hurt once more. Refusing the return does the opposite. It teaches you in the only language that reaches that deep that your tenderness is not collateral, that your pain is not acceptable, that you are not a person who exists to absorb wounds and then forgive them on demand. The refusal is not only protection from them, it is a message to yourself about what you are worth, and that message may heal more than anything they could ever say. There is a cruel timing to when this need arrives, and you should expect it because it tends to catch people off guard. The collapse of their self-story and the reaching that follows so often comes not when you are still raw and would have welcomed it, but precisely when you have begun to heal, when you have started to move on, when the wall of your own life has begun to close over the space they left. This is not coincidence. While you were still hurting and still near, the avoidance story held because you had not really gone. You were still reachable, still there to be returned to whenever they chose, and so the need stayed manageable. It is only when you genuinely move on that the loss becomes total enough to bring the wall down, and the need floods in, which means their reaching is frequently triggered by your recovery rather than arriving to reward your patience. The further you travel from them, the more likely their need is to surface, drawn out by the very distance your healing created, and so their desperate reaching, far from being a reason to return, is actually the proof that your leaving reached them, that your healing worked, and to abandon your recovery in response to it would be to undo the one thing that finally made them feel what they spent the whole relationship refusing to feel. There is also a harder possibility that must be faced because pretending otherwise would fail you. The need may never reach you at all. Some avoidants are so thoroughly defended that even the collapse of the self-story happens entirely in private, walled off from you, so that the need forms and is felt and is buried without you ever receiving a single sign of it. If this is your situation, waiting for a reaching that never comes, hear this with care. The silence is not a verdict about you. It is produced by the same defended machinery that hurt you all along, and the failure of their need to reach you is a failure of their capacity, not a measure of your worth or of the depth of what they feel. A person can need you to the end of their days and never let it show, and none of that reflects on whether you were worth needing. You were. And you do not need to witness their need in order to heal, because your wholeness was never contingent on their reaching. You can close this chapter yourself, on your own authority, and the peace you build that way cannot be taken from you by their silence, because it never depended on their reaching in the first place.